Winter in the Middle Ages was not simply a season, it was a test of endurance, preparation, and willpower. When the sun dipped low and the fields turned barren, survival itself became a daily battle. For the wealthy, survival meant tapestries on stone walls, roaring hearths, salted meats, and strong wine. For the poor, it meant rationing the last loaf of bread, scraping porridge from a pot, and praying for spring. A medieval proverb summed it up bluntly: "Winter eateth what summer groweth." In those few words lies the stark reality: if you failed to prepare in summer, winter would claim its price in hunger, sickness, and sometimes death. If you're fascinated by the resilience of past societies, by the ingenious methods humans used to overcome nature's cruelties, then stay with us. Because in this story, we're not just learning about food and fire, we're uncovering the spirit of survival itself. Imagine yourself in the Middle Ages, stripped of modern comforts, armed only with your wits, your harvest, and your community. Could you survive a medieval winter? By the end of this journey, you'll know the answer. The harsh grip of the Little Ice Age. For much of early medieval Europe, winters were always harsh. But around the 14th century, climate began to shift in what historians now call the Little Ice Age. Beginning roughly around 1300, it brought colder temperatures, unpredictable storms, and crop failures. This wasn't just weather, it was destiny. Frosts killed grain, rivers froze solid, and entire villages were cut off from trade. In Italy, chroniclers described jousting tournaments on frozen rivers. In England, apples froze so hard they had to be thawed in fire before eating. For ordinary people, these weren't quaint tales, they were survival challenges. Every decision in the warm months, from how much grain to store, to which animals to slaughter, to what clothing to spin, determined whether you made it to spring. In this deep dive, we'll explore exactly how medieval people endured these winters. We'll uncover the foods they ate, the clothing they wore, the religious practices that shaped their diets, the social hierarchies that determined who lived in relative comfort and who shivered in hunger. And, along the way, we'll examine the ingenuity, traditions, and endurance that made survival possible. Stockpiling for survival, summer's work, winter's lifeline. The foundation of surviving a medieval winter was preparation. Unlike today, there were no supermarkets to fill gaps, no supply chains delivering exotic goods from overseas. What you grew, what you raised, and what you preserved, that was what you lived on. Peasants and townsfolk alike understood this rhythm. The summer sun wasn't just for harvest, it was for filling barns and granaries with grain, salting meat, smoking fish, and drying fruit. Wheat and barley were lifelines. Preserved properly, they could last the winter, ground into flour when mills still turned, or boiled whole into porridge when mills froze. To protect against rot and rodents, farmers layered thorny plants like gorse beneath the grain piles, keeping them raised from damp floors. These tricks weren't conveniences, they were matters of survival. Livestock played another crucial role. Summer and autumn were the times to fatten pigs, cattle, and geese. Come November, slaughter season began. Martinmas, celebrated on November 11th, marked not just a feast but the dividing line between plenty and scarcity. Fresh beef and pork filled the tables, but once the feast ended, most animals were preserved. Meat was salted in great barrels, smoked in rafters thick with fire smoke, or dried into tough strips. Every part of the animal was used, organs pickled, blood turned into sausages, fat rendered into tallow for cooking or candles. And yet, for most peasants, meat was still a rarity. Pork and bacon were the most accessible, as pigs were cheaper to raise than cows. But even then, winter meant salted toughness, boiled endlessly to soften it. For nobles, venison, or even porpoise graced banquet tables, flavored with saffron or sugar. The contrast between classes could not have been sharper. One family boiled salted pork, another savored venison frumenti beside roaring fires. The role of frumenti, a winter staple. Among the most important winter dishes was frumenti, a hearty porridge of wheat or barley boiled in milk or almond milk, thickened with egg yolks. For peasants, it was simple nourishment. For nobles, it could be enriched with saffron, sugar, or even served alongside venison. Recipes for frumenti appear in some of the earliest medieval cookbooks, including Le Viandier de Taillevent and the Fermi of Curry. For ordinary people, frumenti wasn't a delicacy, it was sustenance. Thick, filling, and warm, it provided the calories needed to work in freezing conditions. Its beauty lay in versatility. It could be savory, flavored with broth, or sweetened with honey if available. In a world where bread might freeze solid, Frumenty was a dish that warmed both body and spirit. The challenge of preservation: salt, smoke, and time. The medieval winter diet depended almost entirely on preservation techniques. Without refrigeration, salt was king. Entire economies revolved around salt production, and towns near salt mines or salt pans became wealthy. Meat and fish were packed in salt to draw out moisture, preventing rot. Smoking added another layer of preservation, with rafters filled with hanging sausages absorbing months of hearth smoke. Fish was particularly important, especially in Christian Europe where religious fasting forbade meat on many days. Pickled herring, salted cod, and stockfish, dried cod cured until as hard as wood, became staples. Stockfish, in particular, could last for years. Hard as a board, it had to be hammered with mallets and boiled for hours before eating, but it sustained countless households through winter and Lent. For peasants, this was reality: tough, salty food boiled endlessly to soften it. For nobles, exotic spices, pepper, cinnamon, saffron, transformed the same staples into refined dishes. Thus, winter meals were not only about survival but about social status. Winter clothing and shelter, battling the cold. Food was only half the battle. The other was warmth. Castles may have been drafty, but they provided protection, roaring fires, and thick tapestries to insulate stone walls. Peasants' cottages, by contrast, were often single-room huts with thatched roofs, earthen floors, and limited heating. Families huddled together around a central fire, smoke venting through holes in the roof. Clothing was another dividing line. Laws like England's sumptuary laws restricted fabrics and furs by class. Nobles wore fur-lined cloaks and layered wool, while peasants had rougher wool garments. Yet even among the poor, layering and ingenuity provided some measure of warmth. Straw mattresses, wool blankets, and sheer proximity to animals in shared spaces all added warmth. Survival meant using every possible resource. In harsher climates like Scandinavia, survival demanded even more creativity. Boots were stuffed with straw for insulation, while cloaks could be coated with wax or fat to help repel moisture. Children often wore hand-me-downs patched dozens of times, and mothers unraveled old garments to reknit them into mittens or socks. Even sleeping arrangements reflected the cold. Families slept tightly together on raised platforms to avoid the freezing floors. For the wealthy, winter fashion was also a statement of power. Ermine-trimmed robes or velvet-lined gowns proclaimed status as much as they provided warmth. For the poor, survival was stitched together, thread by thread. Faith and fasting, religion's grip on winter diets. Religion played a profound role in shaping winter diets. The Catholic Church's calendar was filled with fasting days, especially Lent, which often fell in the heart of winter. On these days, meat, eggs, and dairy were forbidden. Instead, people relied on fish, legumes, nuts, and alternative milks like almond or hazelnut milk. These substitutes weren't luxuries, they were necessities to comply with both faith and law. Lent was especially challenging because by February or March, food stores were often running low. Meat was long gone, grain supplies dwindling, and hunger at its worst. To abstain from even eggs and dairy in this season required endurance. Yet faith was as much a survival mechanism as food. Belief gave meaning to suffering, framing deprivation as spiritual discipline rather than mere scarcity. Monasteries played a central role in this rhythm of fasting and feasting. Monks kept careful calendars of holy days, shaping community diets with precision. In towns, fishmongers thrived during Lent, selling salted herring, eels, or dried cod to hungry customers. Even the wealthy had to adjust. Lavish Lenten feasts might include elaborate almond milk dishes or pastries sweetened with honey instead of butter. For peasants, it was often simpler: thin pea soup, black bread, or a handful of dried beans. Still, the Church's strict calendar created unity. Everyone, rich or poor, noble or peasant, shared in the ritual of restraint, which gave rhythm and meaning to the otherwise brutal scarcity of winter. Disease and malnutrition, winter's silent killers. Even with preparation, winter brought sickness. Cold, damp homes bred respiratory illnesses. Malnutrition from monotonous diets weakened immune systems. Vitamin deficiencies, especially scurvy from lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, could set in. For children and the elderly, winters were often deadly. Chroniclers described famine years when people boiled grass or chewed on bark. In such times, survival rates plummeted. Yet communities developed resilience. Shared resources, communal ovens, and charity from monasteries provided lifelines. Almsgiving was both a religious duty and a social necessity. In this way, survival was never entirely individual, it was collective. But the specter of disease loomed over every winter. Tuberculosis and pneumonia thrived in smoke-filled, poorly ventilated cottages. Typhus and dysentery could sweep through cramped households, carried by lice and contaminated water. Malnutrition didn't just weaken the body, it left entire villages vulnerable to outbreaks that might otherwise have been survivable. Winter famine years often saw the highest burial rates, with churchyards filling under the weight of hunger and illness. Still, necessity sparked invention. Herbal remedies, garlic for coughs, nettle teas for strength, honey for wounds, were passed down through generations. Women, often the healers of their households, became frontline defenders against malnutrition and disease. Monks, too, cultivated medicinal gardens, offering tinctures and balms to the sick. These traditions didn't eliminate winter's silent killers, but they gave hope. For every tragedy, there were stories of endurance, where human solidarity and simple remedies carried communities through the darkest months. A world on the edge of hunger. As the snow fell and rivers froze, medieval life slowed to a rhythm of survival. Work was fewer hours, wages shrank, and food prices rose. Peasants spent as much as 70% of their income on food, leaving little for anything else. For the wealthy, feasts still shone with roasted meats and sugared sweets. For the poor, each day was measured in loaves, porridges, and prayers. To survive a medieval winter was to live constantly on the edge of hunger, clinging to the hope of spring. It was a world both fragile and resilient, one where every grain stored, every animal preserved, every cloak mended could mean the difference between life and death. Festivals of fire and faith, keeping spirits alive. Survival in the medieval world wasn't only about food and fire, it was about spirit. In the long, dark months, festivals became a vital tool of endurance. They broke up the monotony of hardship and offered hope when the nights were longest. Yule and Christmas were the first of these lifelines. In pagan times, Yule marked the winter solstice, the point when the days stopped shortening and began to lengthen. Fires, evergreen branches, and feasts celebrated the promise of returning light. Christianity reshaped these traditions, turning them into Christmas celebrations centered on Christ's birth, but the symbolism remained: light breaking the darkness, warmth defeating the cold. Later came Carnival, usually in February, just before Lent began. Carnival was a festival of excess, when communities indulged in what remained of meat, butter, and cheese before weeks of fasting. Colorful masks, bonfires, songs, and dances gave peasants a chance to forget hunger and cold, if only for a few nights. In some ways, Carnival was as much about survival as preservation. It gave people the morale to endure the final, hardest weeks of winter. Winter trade and the lifeline of markets. While peasants survived on their own stores, towns and cities relied heavily on trade. Winter markets were essential, especially in larger urban centers like Paris, London, or Cologne. Frozen rivers became highways for sledges, carrying salted fish, preserved grain, or barrels of ale. Merchants braved snow and ice to supply towns with what little could be moved. Salted fish from the North Sea, wine from the south of France, spices from the east, all made their way to Europe's markets even in the coldest months. For the wealthy, this meant variety. For the poor, it meant the occasional chance to buy a salted herring or a loaf of bread when their own stores ran low. But trade in winter was fragile. A snowstorm could block roads, frozen seas could delay ships, and famine in one region often spilled into another. Scarcity drove prices sky high. Chroniclers in 14th century England wrote of wheat prices doubling in hard winters. In famine years, bread was stretched with fillers like beans, peas, chestnut flour, or even ground acorns. Sometimes, bakers mixed sawdust or clay to bulk out loaves, leading to illness and further despair. Winter trade could be a lifeline, but only for those who could afford it. The Great Famines, when winter turned deadly. The harshest test of medieval survival came during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, one of the most catastrophic events of the Middle Ages. Heavy rains ruined harvests, grain rotted in fields, and livestock diseases swept through herds. By winter, the food crisis was acute. Chroniclers wrote of desperate measures: horses, dogs, and even vermin were eaten. Rumors circulated of cannibalism in some regions, though whether true or exaggerated, they reveal the terror of hunger. In many towns, bakers were lynched when they could no longer supply bread. Bread was adulterated with whatever could be found, from beans to tree bark. Starvation killed millions across Europe and revealed the razor's edge on which medieval society lived. Entire villages were abandoned. Children died in droves. And yet, some endured, turning to foraging, trading favors for food, or relying on charity from monasteries. Winter magnified these crises. Without crops or livestock to rely on, communities were left with dwindling stores and prayers for relief. Disease followed hunger, and famine weakened whole generations. The Great Famine was a reminder that, for all the ingenuity of salt, smoke, and storehouses, medieval survival was still at the mercy of nature. Medicine, folklore, and protection against the cold. When illness struck in winter, options were limited. Physicians, if one could afford them, prescribed warm tonics of wine, honey, and herbs to balance the humors. Cough syrups made of licorice, horehound, and fennel were common remedies. For the poor, healers relied on folklore, garlic to ward off chills, charms to banish fever, or poultices of onions and herbs applied to the chest. Fireplaces were thought to dry out the body dangerously, so balance was key. Too much warmth, some physicians warned, weakened the heart. Too much cold, of course, was lethal. Superstitions flourished in the dark season, charms hung over doors to keep away evil spirits, and midwinter was believed to be a time when the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin. These beliefs added another layer to the already heavy burden of surviving winter. Folk remedies and rituals reflected both desperation and hope. Hot stones wrapped in cloth were slipped into beds as makeshift heaters, while salt was sprinkled across thresholds to keep out illness. Some wore amulets containing dried herbs or animal bones, believing these objects absorbed sickness before it struck. In certain regions, midwives doubled as healers, blending practical knowledge of herbs with whispered incantations meant to drive away unseen forces. Monasteries offered a more structured form of care, with infirmaries that dispensed herbal brews and spiritual prayers side by side. Science, faith, and superstition were inseparable in winter, woven into one fragile defense against the cold's deadly grip. Psychological survival, hope in the darkness. Equally important as food and warmth was the mental endurance of winter. Darkness stretched for 16 hours in northern Europe, and isolation gnawed at morale. Storytelling became a tool of survival. Families gathered around hearth fires to hear legends, saints' lives, or folk tales of heroes who overcame monsters and odds. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were morale boosters, reminding listeners that endurance was possible, that hardship had meaning. Religion, too, gave structure to suffering. Lent framed deprivation as holy. Winter prayers and candlelit masses reassured people that their struggles were shared. Bells rang through snow-covered villages, summoning people to faith and community. Even in isolation, people were tied to a larger rhythm of belief that carried them through. But winter's psychological strain was deeper than hunger or chill, it was the sheer monotony. Days blurred into long nights, and with fields barren, work was scarce. Hope became a survival tool. Villagers marked time with festivals like Candlemas or Carnival, bursts of light and celebration that broke the gloom. Music, dance, and shared feasts, even when meager, provided crucial release. Children played simple winter games, their laughter defying the darkness. Adults found purpose in communal projects, repairing tools, or preparing for spring. Some wore amulets containing dried herbs or animal bones, believing these objects absorbed sickness before it struck. In certain regions, midwives doubled as healers, blending practical knowledge of herbs with whispered incantations meant to drive away unseen forces. Monasteries offered a more structured form of care, with infirmaries that dispensed herbal brews and spiritual prayers side by side. Science, faith, and superstition were inseparable in winter, woven into one fragile defense against the cold's deadly grip. Psychological survival, hope in the darkness. Equally important as food and warmth was the mental endurance of winter. Darkness stretched for 16 hours in northern Europe, and isolation gnawed at morale. Storytelling became a tool of survival. Families gathered around hearth fires to hear legends, saints' lives, or folk tales of heroes who overcame monsters and odds. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were morale boosters, reminding listeners that endurance was possible, that hardship had meaning. Religion, too, gave structure to suffering. Lent framed deprivation as holy. Winter prayers and candlelit masses reassured people that their struggles were shared. Bells rang through snow-covered villages, summoning people to faith and community. Even in isolation, people were tied to a larger rhythm of belief that carried them through. But winter's psychological strain was deeper than hunger or chill, it was the sheer monotony. Days blurred into long nights, and with fields barren, work was scarce. Hope became a survival tool. Villagers marked time with festivals like Candlemas or Carnival, bursts of light and celebration that broke the gloom. Music, dance, and shared feasts, even when meager, provided crucial release. Children played simple winter games, their laughter defying the darkness. Adults found purpose in communal projects, repairing tools or preparing for spring. The smallest rituals, from lighting a candle at dusk to exchanging blessings with neighbors, pushed back against despair. In this way, hope was not abstract but practical, a weapon of the spirit as vital as bread or fire. Nobles versus peasants, a tale of two winters. The divide between rich and poor was never sharper than in winter. In noble castles, long feasts stretched through the season. Venison, swan, or roasted boar might grace banquet halls, accompanied by imported wine and spices. The warmth of fireplaces, the glow of candles, and the laughter of minstrels softened the cruelty of winter. For peasants, the scene was starkly different. Salted bacon, thin porridge, and black bread stretched across weeks. Fires were small, fueled by what little wood or peat could be gathered. Families huddled together, often in a single room with livestock, their breath freezing in the night air. Winter was a season not of luxury but of calculation: how to stretch food, how to mend worn clothes, how to endure. Yet even the wealthy were not immune. Harsh winters froze rivers, halted trade, and brought famine to their gates. Disease respected no class. And so, even within the walls of privilege, winter remained a threat. The arrival of spring, a season of relief and renewal. When spring finally came, it was more than a change in weather, it was rebirth. Rivers thawed, fields softened, and new shoots appeared. For peasants, spring meant planting time, a return to work and hope. The first fresh greens, nettles, leeks, or wild herbs, were often the only relief from months of salt and smoke. Spring festivals erupted with joy. May Day, Beltane, and Easter celebrated fertility, resurrection, and renewal. After the darkness, hunger, and fasting, these festivals were a reminder that life returned, that hardship had meaning because it led to renewal. Yet survival into spring was not guaranteed. Many families emerged weakened, livestock herds depleted, and debts owed from borrowing grain or seed. Survival was only the beginning, the cycle of preparation began again, as summer's harvests were already needed to prepare for the next winter. A legacy of resilience. Looking back, the medieval winter reminds us of human resilience. Without technology, without modern medicine, without global supply chains, ordinary people endured seasons that tested body and spirit. They adapted, preserved, shared, and believed. They created traditions that carried meaning across centuries. Winter in the Middle Ages wasn't just about survival, it was about identity. The foods, the festivals, the prayers, and the stories all shaped communities. In some ways, their struggle was harsher than ours. In others, it was richer, tied more closely to the cycles of nature and the bonds of community. Could you survive a medieval winter? So now we return to the question we asked at the beginning: could you survive a medieval winter? Imagine the hunger, the cold, the long nights without light, the monotonous diet of salt and smoke. Imagine rationing bread for weeks, hammering stockfish with a mallet, or shivering under a wool cloak as the wind howls through the cracks of your cottage. But also imagine the resilience, the joy of a feast after fasting, the warmth of a fire shared with family, the hope of spring after the snow. This was life in the Middle Ages, fragile, difficult, yet deeply human. If this journey through medieval survival has fascinated you, don't stop here. History is full of lessons, not just about the past but about resilience, endurance, and the strength of communities. Subscribe, share, and stay with us as we continue to uncover the hidden stories of human endurance. Because in every struggle of the past, there's a mirror to our present, and a guide for our future.